All right, continuing on with Christ the Eternal Tao. We got through part 1 and part 2 of the book. We are now in part 3. Part 3 is entitled Uniting Oneself to the Incarnate Tao Through Watchfulness and Prayer. Chapter 1 is entitled Changing the Eye of the Soul. Subsection 1 is New Possibilities. Here we go. In the foregoing, we have discussed what has been realized and revealed of the Tao in human history, culminating in the incarnation of the Tao and the revelation of the Triad. By itself, knowledge of these revelations is useless. They cannot be separated from life, but call for a radical transformation of our whole being. Christ did much more than reveal who God is. Through his coming, man not only achieved the self-emptying of Lao Tzu, valued so much, now in a way unknown before, his immortal spirit becomes wholly filled with the divinizing, uncreated energy, grace, or day of God. With Christ, man not only returns to the primordial state which Lao Tzu sought, now he rises beyond even this, the mystical union with the personal absolute that was originally intended for man. Through Christ's self-emptying on the cross, the way to heaven becomes open to man, and man experiences the Tao of heaven in the plenitude of his being. The following chapters will be devoted to these new possibilities in the spiritual life of man. Here, the experience of Lao Tzu will continue to provide us with a springboard from which to show what has been opened to humanity through the coming of Christ. Subsection 2, the soul and the spirit. In discussing the spiritual life of man, it is first necessary to speak of man's spirit itself. An understanding of the human spirit is not dependent on divine revelation. It can be arrived at least in part, by silently observing one's inward being. Therefore, it is not to be expected that the teachings of ancient Christians concerning the spirit of man would find exact parallels in the followers of Lao Tzu's teaching in China. Our spirit is not a portion or a particle of the Creator's spirit, but it is an image of it. It is the most personal part of man, the principle of his conscience and freedom. It might be said to be the seed of the human person, which contains in itself the whole of man's nature. It is our spirit that constitutes the image of God in us. As God is light, so also our spirit is light. Having been breathed into us by God, it seeks God, knows God, and in him alone finds rest. As the creation originally came into being through the Word, the Tao, the Logos, so now it is guided and sustained by being informed, as it were, by the Word. Our spirit is the faculty that can actually hear the wordless voice of the Word speaking in us. Both Christ and Lao Tzu called man's spirit the light. Followers of Lao Tzu's teaching in China came to call it the original spirit, Yuan Shen, while the ancient Chinese ascetics called it the nous, a Greek word which may be translated as spirit or higher mind. In the life of fallen, unregenerate man, the spirit is hidden behind the lower consciousness of thoughts, fantasies, and emotions. In traditional Christian terminology, this lower consciousness is said to be of the lower aspect of the soul. Followers of Lao Tzu in China called it the conscious spirit, or knowledge spirit, Shi Shen. Potentially the spirit, nous or Yuan Shen, is pure, formless, imageless awareness, unconditioned and uncompounded. Its aim and designation is to draw ever closer and unite itself to its creator. Provided it is purified, it knows God and the inner essence of created things through direct intuitive perception. Among the visible creation, man alone possesses such a spirit. The lower soul, Shi Shen, on the other hand, is shaped by personal and cultural conditioning. It reacts to its environment based on this conditioning, just as an animal does. Its concerns rest in man's temporal earthly seeds. Since man's departure from the way, it has become a mass of emotions, memories, and compounded thoughts, and seeks to know things through imagination and abstract deduction. In its lowest part, the lower soul resembles the soul of an animal, since animals also possess emotion, memory, and imagination. Ultimately, the distinction between the spirit and the lower soul must be seen as an analogy. It is not that there are two beings inside of us, rather, the spirit and the lower soul are different aspects of our inward being. The spirit might be said to be the hidden side of our inward being and the purest part of our soul. The ancient Christian teachers called the spirit, quote, the eye of the soul, unquote, since it is the organ which perceives divinity. The great mystic writer Maximus the Confessor puts it this way, quote, the soul has three powers. First, the power of nourishment and growth. Second, that of imagination and instinct. Third, that of the higher intelligence, logikos, and the spirit, nous. nous. Plants share only in the first of these powers. Animals share in the first and second. Men share in all three. The first two powers are perishable, and the third is clearly imperishable and immortal. Man, therefore, is composed of body and soul, and the spirit is the highest part of the soul. We may even call the spirit the higher soul. Lao Tzu did this in chapter 10 of the Tao Te Ching, where he spoke of the superior soul and the inferior or animal soul. Subsection 3, the spirit as master. In the inner life of man, the spirit is meant to be the master, and the lower soul is to be the servant, while the body is to be the servant of both. The true ruler, writes St. Maximus, is he who rules over himself and has subjected the soul and the body to the spirit. St. Theophan the Recluse, a modern teacher of ancient wisdom, likewise states, quote, according to natural purpose, man must live in the spirit, subordinate everything to the spirit, be penetrated by the spirit in all that it is of the soul, and even more so in all that is physical, and beyond these in the outward things too, that is family and social life. This is the norm, end quote. When this hierarchy is maintained, he will no longer trust our thoughts, fantasies. And when this hierarchy is maintained, we will no longer trust our thoughts, fantasies, and reasoning powers. Even amidst our daily activities, conditioned by our culture and environment, our soul will continually return to the direct intuitive knowledge of our spirit. As Lao Tzu put it, quote, use your light to return to the light of the insight. The soul knows the truth by its unbroken connection with the subordination to the spirit, while the spirit knows through its connection with the subordination to its creator, the Tao, the Logos. St. Theophan writes further, quote, when the spiritual reigns supreme in someone, then, although this is his exclusive character and attitude, he does not err. This is because, in the first place, spirituality is the norm of human life, and so, as a result, being spiritual, he is a real person, whereas the intellectual or carnal man is not a real person. Secondly, no matter how spiritual someone is, he cannot help but give the intellectual and carnal their rightful place. He maintains just a little of them in subordination to the spirit. Let intellectuality be not too broad within him in scientific knowledge, arts, and other subjects, and let carnality be firmly restrained. Then he is a real, whole person. But the man of intellect, the expert, the connoisseur, the shrewd man, and even more so the carnal man, is not a real person, no matter how appealing he seems outwardly, end quote. With mankind's departure from the way, the natural hierarchy has been reversed. The body and the lower aspect of the soul are now the masters. They have taken over the human being, who is now carried about by thoughts, imagination, emotions, and bodily concerns. As we have shown in the previous part, the soul of fallen man has come under the illusion of its self-sufficiency. Therefore, it is not satisfied with concerning itself with a man's temporal needs, food, clothing, shelter, but seeks also means towards a man's ascendancy and sensual pleasure. Such a soul has become, or better yet to say, has attached itself to, what is today called an ego. While the spirit is our true self, the true seat of our personhood, the ego is our false self, an illusory self-sufficient entity. Because it thinks to achieve its ends and overcome obstacles through its own unaided powers, the ego can also be called our false problem solver. Having become the master of the man through the illusion of its autonomy, the ego does what it can to conceal the existence of the spirit. In this way, the spirit is not allowed to fulfill its designation of rising to God, and thus its light becomes darkened. Its light has not been put out. It is still light, but because it stands apart from the Creator, this light is darkness. That is why Christ said, quote, take heed that the light which is in you be not darkness, end quote. Since the spirit is now held captive by the ego in the realm of the senses, it has also become sick. The only cure for this sickness is to give the spirit its rightful mastery by stripping the soul of the form of the ego. When the lower soul is refined in this way, says St. Theophan, quote, the soul grows into the spirit and blends with it, end quote. Lao Tzu describes this as follows. When the superior soul and the inferior soul are held together in one embrace, they can be kept from separating. When the soul takes the position of servant and aligns itself with the spirit, then the spirit returns itself and naturally fulfills its true purpose, rising to the Creator. St. Basil the Great describes this spiritual process as follows, quote, When the spirit, nous, is not engaged by external affairs, nor diffused through the senses over the whole world, it retires within itself. Then it ascends spontaneously to the consideration of God." End quote. Lao Tzu, in concentrating his spirit and not scattering in the sensual realm, was able to partake of this experience. He wrote, quote, "The 5 colors blind men's eyes, the 5 tones deafen men's ears, the 5 flavors dull men's sense of taste. Galloping and hunting derange men's mind, rare articles conduct astray. On this account the sage regards not the eye, but the inner things." And in this account, Lao Tzu's spirit was able to rise in contemplation of the qualities of the Tao, aligning itself with the way of heaven. Now the Tao has become flesh. A much closer connection is possible between man's spirit, the seat of his true personhood, and the person of the Tao. It is a connection that passes into union, into the very deification of man's spirit by a special action of uncreated day. Before describing this lofty condition of the human spirit, however, it is necessary to speak in greater detail about our present unregenerate condition, so as to show what it is we must transcend and overcome.
Daddy.
Subsection 4, the life of the ego. At the moment of man's first act of disobedience to the way, there suddenly appeared in him a sense that he had become wrong. This fundamental sense of wrongness, quote, "the knowledge of good and evil," unquote, marked the birth of his ego and thus of his self-consciousness. As we saw in the previous part, he lost the garment of uncreated light in which he had been clothed and thus became aware that he was naked. Since man's ego was born through his trying to become God unto himself, it is in the very nature of the ego to try to become autonomous. Hence, the ego shrinks from admitting it is wrong. To admit this would be to admit that it is not a God, and that there is a standard higher than itself. This fear of admission was first seen in the ego's attempt to, quote unquote, hide the presence of God among the trees of the garden. But the ego not only attempts to hide from God, as we have seen, it also attempts to hide from the spirit. For the spirit, too, convicts the ego of its wrongness. Since the spirit, and not the ego, is supposed to be the master of the person, its very presence exposes the ego as a false usurper and destroys the very basis for the ego's existence. How can the human ego, immersed in its own gratification, hide from the ever-present reality of God and the spirit? How else then, by a constant state of distraction into sensual pleasures, thoughts, memories, and fantasies? Thus, man's fall into disobedience was at once a fall into distraction, and that was how his consciousness started to become as compounded and fragmented as it is today. To distract himself from facing his wrongness, man seeks out the very things that made him wrong in the first place: self-love and sensual pleasure. Gratifying himself in this way, he feels, quote-unquote, right again, but only temporarily. Actually, he has only become more wrong, so that now he needs even greater distractions and even greater shocks to make him feel that he is right. In this way, he progresses further along the path of self-destruction, trying to overcome his predicament by its very cause. Our ego seeks any reassurance that, in fact, we are all right, that we did not make a mistake, and that we are God, after all. Our conscious selves may not admit that this is happening, but that it is the actual underlying aim of our ego life, to find anything that will enable us to forget our true selves and our hideous condition, and will make us feel, if only for a brief moment of ecstasy, that we are God, that we are in control, on top of things, and sufficient unto ourselves. Such is the principle behind man's constant desire to escape into the sensual pleasures of food, sex, drugs, alcohol, tobacco, and entertainment, etc. His desire for, quote-unquote, love, popularity, recognition, glory, power, group status, acceptance, and admiration for his physical appearance, and his desire to puff himself up through hatred, judgment, and condemnation of others. The ego, or problem solver, works toward its aims through two powers. One, the calculating machine of the human brain, with its faculties of analysis, contrivance, planning, and fantasy. And two, resentment. With the former, man tries to get something, and thus gives himself the illusion that he is on top of everything. With the latter, he tries automatically, through habit, without even thinking, to get on top of something by resenting or judging, condemning it. When it initially enters, resentment is not yet an emotion or even a thought. It is a kind of mechanism which the ego uses in order to immediately exalt itself over something or someone, especially someone who makes the person feel like less of a god, and only later do thoughts and emotions attach themselves to it. When we are truly humble and in submission to God, it is possible to discern right away right from wrong without judging or condemning. But when we are playing God, we cannot discern, we can only judge. Even if our judgment is technically correct, it is still essentially wrong, because we have made it in order to feel more right than the person whom we have judged. This is judgment on the level of the ego, blocking us from God, rather than discernment on the level of the spirit, which comes from God. Quote, "Judge not according to the appearance," said Christ, "but judge righteous judgment," end quote. Unfortunately, the prideful person will not be able to differentiate between these two, but will judge according to appearances when he thinks he is discerning. The only factor that distinguishes them is humility. When an injustice occurs to a humble person, he will not react inwardly. He will discern the injustice without resenting it. When the same injustice happens to a person with an ego, he will immediately react with resentment. In both cases, this occurs at first without thought. When resentment passes into thought, it becomes what we call judgment. If a person's will is subconsciously inclined to the desire to get on top and play God, his consciousness attracts to itself all kinds of thoughts through which he can cherish, relish, and hopefully fulfill his desire. Thoughts of being accepted and admired, judgmental thoughts, sensual, materialistic thoughts, etc. If he continues to play around with these thoughts, then emotions attach to them. Emotion literally means to move away from. Through it, a person moves away from his true self, his spirit. Once emotions attach themselves to thoughts, they arouse more and more thoughts. The person loses himself in his thoughts and feelings as in a kind of virtual reality, unaware that he can stand back from them. His thinking has become compulsive, fed by the powerful combination of thought, desire, emotion, which we call, quote-unquote, passion. Such is the life of the ego. Man's spirit is directed solely by the passions and moves further and further from its creator. Subsection 5, Metanoia. Even if we stray far from the way and lose all awareness of our spirit, still that spirit longs to fulfill its purpose, and still the wordless word speaks to it, calling it back to himself. This longing and this calling is felt by the soul as an internal conflict, a gnawing, unnamed suffering. The way, however, may not only use internal moral suffering to call us back. He may also work through physical pain or through emotional pain arising from the loss of a loved one or any other of our earthly attachments. At the time, we may find this to be terrible and unnecessarily cruel. But later, if we are able to look at it objectively, we will see that, considering the seriousness of our previous condition, the Word, in fact, acted as gently as possible in effecting the cure. Through suffering, we are stopped short in our self-worship in pursuit of earthly gratification. We find that our old distractions no longer work as they did before. They no longer stop the pain. Finally, we are forced to face that we had been running from Finally, we are forced to face what we have been running from all our lives. We are forced to face ourselves as we really are, and it is a gruesome sight. The ego cries out that if we truly face our sickness, the end is at hand, and this is true, for it will mean the end of the ego's tyranny. For our true selves, however, it marks the beginning of a new life. As Lao Tzu put it, if one is sick of sickness, then one is not sick. If the sage is not sick because he is sick of sickness, therefore he is not sick. The full wretchedness of our condition is not seen all at once, for our spiritual eyes have only been opened part way. But enough of it is seen to make us realize the need to change. Then begins the slow and painful process of what Christ called repentance. Repentance means much more than regret. In its original Greek form, metanoia, it literally means to change the spirit, the nous. to purify the eye of the soul. Metanoia begins with the realignment of all our powers away from our former loves for ourselves and for created things, and toward the Tao, the way of the universe, the wordless word from whom we have been fleeing. With this occurs, in the words of Lao Tzu, a reversal or return. We are no longer giving the lower soul mastery, for we are striving to death of the ego or false identity that has made a home in it. Now the spirit is allowed to get out from under the ego and resume its rightful place. Our human action is the beginning of metanoia, but the completion of it lies in the divine action of the wordless word within us. This occurs in the following way. Now that our spirit has begun to regain mastery, we experience the yearning that is natural to it, the yearning for our Maker. Along with this comes the yearning for that which separates us from Him to be removed. We yearn to be cleansed from our corruption. And so the spirit in man calls out, perhaps not with words, perhaps without knowing the name of Him to whom it calls, and the wordless word, having come out to meet man's spirit, responds. He completes what man has begun in the process of metanoia, for it is He who renews and purifies man's spirit through the same power by which He created it in the first place. The Apostle Paul called this being, quote, transformed by the renewing of your mind, your nous, end quote. Christ said it means to be, quote, be converted, to be turned, end quote. We know that our metanoia is genuine, that is, that a divine change has really occurred in us when we have a revulsion for what before appeared sweet to us. This is what Lao Tzu meant by being sick of sickness. In the words of Saint Isaiah the Solitary, quote, when a man severs himself from evil, he gains an exact understanding of all the sins he has committed against God. For he does not see his sins unless he severs himself from them with a feeling of revulsion. Those who have reached this level pray to God with tears and are filled with shame when they recall their evil love passions. End quote. Subsection 6, forgiveness. When the purification of our spirit occurs, we experience it as forgiveness. We know that we are corrupted and that we were not capable of purifying ourselves. Moreover, we sense intuitively that we had corrupted ourselves of our own volition, and hence were not deserving of being purified by some power outside ourselves. And yet in the manner of surpassing nature, we have been cleansed, and so this comes to us as a kind of wondrous mystery. When we experience this mystery, another mystery occurs. Having felt that we have received forgiveness undeservedly, we now become ready to forgive everyone, everything, to shed all the hidden resentments that had separated us from the way. These resentments are like chains which bind us to the objects of our bitterness, and now we are free from them. Thus, in forgiving, we are no longer bound to this earth and are at last free to love the wordless Word who has forgiven us. Even before the coming of the Word in the flesh, His forgiveness was felt by those who initiated the process of metanoia in themselves. Thus the prophet David wrote in the Psalms, "You have broken my bonds asunder. I shall offer a sacrifice of praise unto you." And again, "You rent my sackcloth and girded me with gladness, that my glory may chant unto you, and that I may not be pierced with sorrow." According to the mystic writer St. Simeon the New Theologian, David's joy in being loosed from the bonds of spiritual corruption came from divine grace, or day, acting on his spirit from the outside. Lao Tzu experienced the same action of the grace of the Tao Logos. He wrote, "Why do the ancients praise the Tao? It is not because by virtue of it he who seeks finds, and the guilty are forgiven. That is why it is such a treasure to the world." When the Tao became man, his forgiveness too became known and witnessed in human history. Those who did not know the Tao Logos and thus did not see him in the man Jesus were baffled when Christ went around forgiving people for their sins. Quote, "Who is this who speaks blasphemes and blasphemies?" End quote, they asked. "Who can forgive sins but God alone?" With the Incarnation, then, the act of forgiveness is seen in its true light as a personal act. It is face to face. Now we call our forgiveness to the Word as He has become known to us in His human incarnation, just as the blind men in the Scriptures called out to Him, quote, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me, and have mercy on me, O us Lord." on us, O Lord, Son of David." End quote. The same way, the process of metanoia is now seen to be enacted, as it were, in human history, in its fully personal dimension. Before the Way became flesh, his followers, such as Lao Tzu, continually put to death the false, corrupted identities of their egos because they knew what this was necessary in order to live according to the Way. With the coming of the Way, this death is now seen in a personal light, in the form of a divine human person hanging on a cross. They ascend the cross with him in order to put their false selves to death. They continue to suffer in this world just as he did, but whereas the suffering of their former selves had been suffering without God, and was in fact due to their separation from him, now their suffering is with him, and is altogether different, even sweet. As Father George Calcia, a priest who endured 22 years in a communist prison, points out, quote, "Christ did not come to explain human suffering or to eliminate it. Rather, he came to fill human suffering with his presence." End quote. Dying with Christ on the cross is the beginning of metanoia, but its culmination lies in being resurrected with him. Just as Christ arose from the grave with a renewed body, so that even his closest disciples failed to recognize him, so does our spirit rise in a renewed form through metanoia. Father Safrani writes, quote, "When a man weeps with his whole being from the pain caused by the knowledge of his vileness, his torment far exceeds any outside suffering, and he sees himself as the worst of men. Prayer in this holy pain can sweep man's spirit into another world. Everyday life is forgotten, and the body no longer makes itself felt. The desert ascetics term this the hell of repentance that likens us to Christ descending into hell, his hell of love. However acute the atomatic torment, however profound the suffering, it is accompanied by the joy of the divine summons and the light of a new life." The end of chapter 1. Next, we will continue with chapter 2, nurturing the seed of uncreated day. Thanks for listening.